Thank you very much, Victorio, for that. It's very nice to be here again, though uh, it's never very nice for me coming up to a talk. I hate it. I really hate it. And usually it takes me maybe 5, 6 times doing a talk before I'm comfortable, before it comes easily. Sadly, this is the first time I'm giving this talk. So I don't expect it to go that smoothly, but I will try and keep it coherent. When I first started to think about this talk a few months ago, I quickly decided it's such a wide subject that rather than try and cover it in its entirety, yeah, sure. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Rather than cover the subject in its entirety, I would really give my perspective on how cameras, how the availability of cameras, the development of cameras have influenced my birding. Mostly for the better, but not entirely for the better. And particularly from the point of view of someone who, from a very early age, first of all, this slide is just a comparison of a great shearwater sketch I did at least 20, 25 years ago, and the great shearwater I photographed of Muxia just 2 weeks ago. And I was quite surprised at the similarity. But in a way, it illustrates what the camera sees and what we see, or what we think we see. I have to be very careful after David's talk about taking anything for granted. Incidentally, I know some people who would have insisted they had a loggerhead shrike, and it took the fence post away with it. So, yes, I've since a very early age, I've sketched birds from life because that was really the only thing you could do before cameras became as good as they are now. And I quite quickly found that it was a very good way of learning, of remembering what I saw. And quite quickly that gave me a considerable advantage over all of my peers, my friends, who were just looking and maybe not remembering very much. So it's something I continued pretty avidly whenever I had a chance. I would sketch something, and the availability of the modern telescope made a huge difference. It meant that for a start you could see the bird much more clearly than with older equipment, and you had 2 hands free, so you could sketch it. So I've been doing this all my life, and I think it has benefited me, well, to the extent that I make my living as a bird artist, and I've been very fortunate to be involved in illustrating a field guide that many of you will be familiar with, and which incidentally is there's a new edition on the way. It was supposed to be printed in September. This is a Swedish copy. The Swedes got their act together and they published it in April. The Collins were supposed to do the same, but they couldn't find the paper stock. And I've been assured that the English edition and the Spanish edition will be available in the next few weeks. So that's the plug. Yeah. Thank you. It's working now. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So I've had the privilege of being able, like David, I guess, being able to devote pretty much every hour of my working day to thinking about birds, looking at birds, trying to paint them, and thinking about their identification in particular. When I talk about modern photography, what I mean is digital photography, which I believe started around 2000. It was 2006 was when I got my first digital camera, and despite some hardened old school photographers assuring me that digital would never take off, within a year or two they all had digital. But some of the old timers here will remember the roll of film with 36 frames that you would expose in your camera, hope for the best, send it off, and you'd see the results maybe two weeks later when they came back in the post. you would end up with these slides, transparencies. They offered a better quality than prints. And for normal use, it was a question of looking at your slides with a little hand lens on a light box. And they were wonderful. They were a fantastic asset. Certainly to my work, I took a lot of photographs and I enjoyed them. And I learned a lot from them. But the difference between old school photography and digital photography is absolutely profound, and it has had a really huge impact on the way we birdwatch, the way we identify birds, the way we communicate about birds. So now, with a digital camera and a suitably big memory card, you can literally take hundreds, thousands of images in a morning, in an hour, depending on what you want. It's limitless. And all these images, first of all, you can see them immediately on the back of your camera. So if you're overexposing or underexposing, you can make the necessary adjustment. You can check details. Very often you can photograph a bird and then view the back of your camera and see it much more clearly than you can through your binoculars. The telescope will usually give you the edge, but that is such a major change. And one of the people in the audience asked David about the potential for making mistakes. I think the potential for making those kind of mistakes is hugely reduced, but there are other kind of mistakes which come from misinterpreting photographs, and that's something I will allude to in this talk. So you have your digital photograph. You could take this in an hour if you wished, and it's a really fantastic source of reference if you have time to look at them. So you can not only see the image on the back of your camera, you can come closer. You can check details. So if you think you have an Isabelline wheatear, or you can check the wing and the face pattern, and assuming you know what an Isabelline is supposed to look like, you can tell this isn't one. This is a northern wheatear. In this talk, I'm going to talk briefly about the difference between illustrated guides, which has always been the conventional way of showing birds with paintings, and this is an example of some of the ones I use most frequently. One or two may be familiar to you. And then photographic guides, which are becoming more and more popular, especially with publishers, because a photographic guide can generally be put together much, much more quickly than an illustrated guide. In our case, this book, when it was first commissioned, it was estimated that it would take me, as a sole artist, between 4 and 5 years. After 5 years, the publishers withdrew because it wasn't happening quickly enough. Fortunately, it was taken over by another publisher. And even with the addition of another artist, Dan Zetterström from Sweden, a very talented, very fast artist, it took us another 8 years, 15 years in total. So publishers, unless they really have a lot of confidence in their artists, they would much prefer to go with photographic guides. And that's probably why there are so many options in the photographic guide range. And at first glance, you could say, well, why isn't a photographic guide much better? Because all the birds are correctly identified. That's exactly how they are. How could you possibly get something better from an illustrated guide, which is going to be an interpretation? It's going to be more prone to making mistakes. But I think the interpretation is really the key. And I'll just go back. First of all, this is how things were. This photograph was taken of myself and a few friends looking at some rare bird, a broad-billed sandpiper, as I recall, in 1979. And I'm taking notes, but you'll notice everyone is looking through a telescope. It's not the same now. Now everyone's looking through a camera. A few people are looking through a telescope, but most people are intent on taking photographs. Can I just ask for a show of hands? How many people take photographs of birds, either digiscoping or with a camera? Okay, it's probably, I'd say close to 50%. I'm surprised it's not higher. So this is how I started. I had a telescope. I was sketching birds, taking notes, trying to understand what I was seeing. And I think I learned a lot in the process. This is my first semi-palmated sandpiper on the right. Probably not immediately identifiable as a sketch, but as it would be in a photograph, but it made sense to me at the time. And I continued sketching, often very rudimentary sketches, something quite simple. It doesn't have to be complete. And that's the thing about sketching. Sketching, the important part is not the sketching, it's the looking. And it's something that I try and encourage if I meet younger bird watchers who are keen to improve. I try and explain to them the importance of actually looking, and not just looking to your camera, not just taking photographs, but looking and thinking about what you're seeing, because it is so beneficial as a learning experience. And often the drawings are incomplete. It just has to be something that I noticed, something that I registered. And when cameras started to become more and more seductive, where you really felt you had to go for the camera, I celebrated the fact that sea watching, looking at seabirds from land, was the last frontier, because the cameras really, in the early cameras, really couldn't do anything with seabirds. So if I wanted to bring something back from a sea watch, I had to keep sketching, and I got some satisfaction from that, because it's very easy not to sketch if you have something on your side that will give you excellent photographs very, very easily. So I got my first camera in 1981. A friend and myself had decided we were going to Spain, south of Spain, for 2 weeks bird watching. I had never been here before, and I wanted to maximize the gain from the trip. And I knew that if I had a camera, I could photograph everything, or at least I imagined I could. From memory, I think I had 15 rolls of film, 36 frames, 540 images. Seemed like a lot then. I could take that in 5 minutes now if I had the right bird. And I photographed my first Egyptian vultures and Darfur warblers and woodlarks, and it was a great trip. But I couldn't remember, when I was thinking about this talk and thinking about this episode, I was trying to remember, I didn't do an awful lot of sketching. And just a few weeks ago, I went back to check my notebook for this trip to Spain. I couldn't find anything. I thought, maybe it was 1981? No, it was 1980. I had absolutely nothing in my notebook. I'm still hoping there's a notebook somewhere else, that maybe I use a different notebook, but no, I'm afraid the camera completely seduced me. And I thought, well, okay, I haven't got any sketches, but I got all these photographs. But I realized quite quickly that I had very few memories. I had the photographs, which are mostly would be trash photographs now, because they were so distant. But I had absorbed very, very little compared with when I was looking. And I learned my lesson. From then on, even when I had my camera, that's the camera hanging off my side, I reminded myself, I really need to sketch. I really need to look at things. And so I didn't give up the sketching. And over the years, I filled many, many notebooks. But even now, I have to admit, I don't sketch nearly as much as I should and as I used to. And I have to consciously force myself to do a sketch, because unlike people perhaps imagine that sketching is great fun, I find it really quite challenging and quite frustrating if you see something very clearly and you don't quite get it. But it is very satisfying when it works. But a lot of the time, it doesn't satisfy very much. So this is an example of, this was a few weeks ago, a citrine wagtail on my local patch, and as I approached the guys there, I just noticed they're all taking photos. They all have their telescopes, but they're all taking photographs. And I thought, well, which is more beneficial to me? These simple sketches that I've been doing for years and years. These are chiffchaff and willow warbler, wood warbler. They don't have a lot of detail, but they still have something. But compared to what people are looking at now, with the digital camera, you can see every detail. You can see the wing formula. If it's a good enough photograph, you can see the wing formula, the difference between a chiffchaff and a willow warbler. And I find this, it's probably very nerdy. I don't know what the Spanish equivalent of nerdy is, but it's perhaps not something I'm proud of, but I find it very interesting because I learn a lot from looking at photographs. But there's an expectation now that everything is going to be identified to this reliability. So a few years ago, when I was bird watching on a southwest headland, Mizzen Head in County Cork, it was October 2007, and just before the evening time, I was watching some bushes, and I heard a hard tack call, which I thought was going to be a lesser whitethroat. It's usually the bird that sounds like that. But out hopped an acrocephalus, which they don't normally, the ones I see, the reed warbler doesn't go tack. So I thought this, and I got a very brief glimpse. I managed to get a photograph, and then it buried itself. And the call reminded me of Blythe's reed warbler, which at the time hadn't been recorded in Ireland. There was no record. And up until comparatively recently, the idea of identifying a Blythe's reed warbler in the field would have been seen as really foolhardy. You have to catch them. You have to look at the wing formula. But with new cameras, that's all changed. But anyway, I hadn't got enough from this photo. I just had the suspicion. I told a few friends. Some of them were on Cape Clear Island, which is a boat journey, a long drive. They definitely wanted to see a Blythe's reed warbler, but they didn't really want to come off Cape Clear Island to see a misidentified reed warbler. So it was important for me to get this one correct. Next morning, I went back. The bird was still there, but it was extremely uncooperative. It was in the bushes, and I was getting, I think there's a bird there somewhere, but I think that's the bird. But it wasn't much use for confirming the identification. And there's another little, there's definitely a bird there. I can see a bit of it, but I just wasn't getting good enough views. And this was over a period of 2 or 3 hours. And I became so despondent. I thought, I'm never going to see this thing properly. And but I persisted. I was on my own. No one joined me at that stage. And eventually, I started to get views. And the funny thing is that all this time, because I'm so preoccupied with my camera, I'm not looking. I'm not taking. If someone had said, "Well, what was the wing length like?" I have no idea. I'm just trying to get photographs because it's very difficult to look critically at the same time as taking photographs of an uncooperative bird. And this is why I have a lot of sympathy for people who are in the field and they find something that could be very rare, and the stress level they're feeling. They may be getting quite good photographs, but the stress level they're feeling when everyone wants to know, is it not, is it? And they're texting people, and people are phoning them, is it a booted warbler, is it a Sykes? And they often send photographs to me. And I just, I enjoy the fact that in my studio, I'm not the one whose reputation is on the block. I have all my references, I can measure the primary projection, it's very, very comfortable. But I know it's not when you're in the field. Anyway, eventually, I got a shot. The clinching shot of, I could see was definitely a Blythe's reed warbler. And I can remember phoning in the guy who does the news service, and he said, so you're sure it's a Blythe's reed? I said, yes, I am. He said, so you stake your reputation on it? I said, well, if it comes to that, I do. Unfortunately, it it was one. And I learned once I was able to relax, I had the photographs, then I started to look at the bird and I started to appreciate that actually it was quite distinctive in some ways when you look at it, when you're not struggling with a camera. And it was while preparing some plates, these are some acrocephalus warbler plates I worked on with a British artist, Richard Johnson. I did all the drawing, he did the painting, and I think they're beautiful. While researching for this a year or two later, I was trawling the internet looking for photographs of reed warblers and Blythe's reed warblers. And on an Irish website of a very keen photographer, I found this bird labeled as a reed warbler. It's a Blythe's reed warbler, and it was taken a year before my bird. So in identifying this as a Blythe's reed warbler, I lost my claim to a first Irish. But that's the way it goes. And it's hard to believe, but in this time since then, since 2007, I think we've now had 12, maybe 15 records of Blythe's reed warbler in Ireland. And I put that down almost entirely to photography and people getting used to looking at photographs of these warblers and being able to manage the identification. So this is just another story about where the camera came in very useful. Those at the back probably think if they can see anything at all, it looks like mosquitoes on the middle of the frame. I took this photograph when I was walking across a lake, Tecumseh Lake, near where I live, and there's quite a long stretch where you have to wade through deep water. I had my telescope on my shoulder, and I saw I was hoping the birds that were on the place I wanted to go to would stay put, but of course as I was halfway across, they took off, and I wanted to see what was there, so I lifted my binoculars and I saw something that I couldn't really say why, but there was something. They were mostly rough, but there was something strange with them, and without having any idea why, stilt sandpiper came to mind. I hadn't seen any features, seen nothing. Stilt sandpiper came into my head, subconsciously almost. So what did I do? Because they were flying high past me, I reached for the camera, which I've got very good at. I'm very quick with my camera, and I took photographs of the whole flock. I didn't know which one was of interest, and sure enough, this one, when I blew up the image, it looked like a stilt sandpiper, which is a very rare bird. And it flew off. It didn't land. It just flew as far as I could see. And I thought, if I hadn't had the camera, would I have seen enough to claim a stilt sandpiper? I'm sure I wouldn't. But with the photographic evidence, well, okay, they're not very good photos, but it's undeniably a stilt sandpiper. And I did find it the next day at another place a few miles away. It wasn't very approachable. It was with this redshank, so I couldn't get close to it. But I could confirm that everything was fine for a winter to maybe a second calendar year stilt sandpiper, a very early molting adult. But a few days later, the same bird was seen in Dublin, 150 kilometers to the north, and photographed. And the guys who found it, they had heard about the one in Wexford, so it was on their radar. The first person who saw it was very inexperienced, but he took a photograph, and it was identified from the photograph. I was very sorry that I lost my chance to see it really well. I really wanted to see this bird well and study it, but it had gone. But then, a couple of weeks later, the same bird was photographed in France. And this is another thing that digital photography allows us. You can do these very forensic examinations of individual birds, and we could see that this isn't a very good photograph, but you could see it was the same bird that was in Ireland, was now in France. this is you've probably gathered I have a bit of a fixation with rare birds. I've always been very keen on rare birds, but again at the same lake, I went down one July morning and very early, and something flew across my vision and landed, and with binoculars I could just see it was strange looking thing, and then it turned its head, and it was a greater sandplover, the first greater sandplover recorded in Ireland, one that we've been talking about since I was a child, thinking someday we're going to get a greater sandplover, and here was one sitting right in front of me. I made some phone calls to people who live half an hour away. They were on their way. I didn't move. It was sitting on its own about 120 meters from me, and I just watched it. It looked very nervous. Then it started to move around, run around, but it was still on its own. And about 25 minutes after I first saw it, it suddenly got up and flew straight away. No deviation, just climbing, climbing, climbing. It was gone. There were 20 people there within an hour, and they spent the whole day there. We didn't see it again. But a couple of weeks later, I was on the computer, and I came across photographs of a greater sandplover in Spain. Where was it? Santona. And really good photographs. And I could see straight away it looked very like my bird, and I went back to my very poor photographs, and using this kind of forensic examination, I could see that there were little details like that white mark across the crown that were just visible in my photographs, and confirmed that it was the same bird. And this is something that is happening more and more often now, thanks to digital photography. We're tracking individual rarities going from country to country. So I'm just going to briefly go back to talk about photographic guides versus illustrated. This is one of the more recent photographic guides. It's the Rob Hume is the author. I can't remember the title, but I think it's Ibis. But you can see what they've done here is they've very much followed the template of the Collins guide by having all these birds in appropriate plumages and ages, and it's very effective and very beautiful. I think the impression of these pages is really very powerful, but I suspect that these books are much more difficult for people to use if they haven't been looking closely at photographs. I don't think that even with the captions, I don't think they communicate the information that we need as clearly, because of the vagaries of light, especially one bird is in heavy shadow, another bird isn't, and I think that makes them ideal for experienced bird watchers, but much more difficult for novices. Here's another couple of pages from the Crossley Guide in North America. And again, they look great. Lots and lots of things to look at. But I don't know about you, but I find this quite confusing. I don't know what I should be comparing, because I don't think they've been curated in the same way as an artist who knows what he's painting curates his images. And I'll just compare this with, these are a couple of plates from the new Lynx Seabirds Guide. These two plates are painted by Swedish artist Hans Larsson, who I think is one of the best. And I don't know if you agree with me, but I think the way the birds are set out, it's with the corresponding plumage in the corresponding place. They're all painted to the same, with the same palette, so you can make comparisons of shades of grey, you can make comparisons of bill colour without worrying about light and shadow as you do with photographs. And so I'd like to think that despite the proliferation of photographic guides and the fact that we are going that way, that there's still another few years left of illustrated guides. And I'm going to show you some pages of some of my favorite books, which I think demonstrate the advantage of illustrations. This is a book, I think it's called a Guide to Japanese Ducks. The text is pretty much all in Japanese, but the illustrations I think are absolutely beautiful. They're so faithful to, they're so correct to the particular ages and sexes, and yet they're so lifelike, and I just think they're beautiful to look at, in a way that if these were all photographs, I wouldn't be drawn to them the same way. I don't think I would trust them the same way, because I have to accommodate for so many variables in the photographs. I'm going to talk to someone from Links, if there's someone from Links here, to try and get this book translated, because it will be a really beautiful book. Sorry, I haven't cropped this one very well, but I can remember in the books, the Shell Guide, for example, that came out 30 years ago, there was a plate of Gargany showing eclipse, juvenile, adult female, and somewhat of plumage. They were all identical, and they were all wrong. There was nothing you could see any difference. But this shows that the artist really has looked at the different plumages, and he has really painted faithfully what he sees. Unfortunately, most of the ducks that are covered in this book are common ducks in Europe too. Do other people feel that that these, maybe it's just me, but that they invite examination in a way that I think photographs don't? Just imagine seeing one of those. This is a Baikal teal. And I'm going to show you another. I was very privileged to see some plates being painted by my friend Ian Lewington, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Ian's work. And Ian has spent the last 10 years almost working on a North American guide. And he showed me the original plates, of which he has maybe 150, and there's another 50 to do. And all these plates are this size. Everything is painted exactly as you see it. There's no photoshopping, there's no anything. And they are absolutely beautiful. And I've come in a little bit closer on some of them so you can see. But I think this demonstrates what illustrations can do at their very, very best. That it'll take a long time, I think, for photography to be as useful as this and as beautiful. So I'm very grateful to Ian for allowing me to show these. And you can see he's arranged them so that the corresponding plumages can be compared, and the details are correct. The birds are shown at exactly the optimum position, not too strong light. So you'll have to get Ian here when this book comes out. Of course, it's a North American book, but there's plenty of people interested in North American birds here. And I couldn't end the talk without at least giving you a quick look at some of the new plates in the third edition books. You'll recognize these are somewhat familiar, because in many cases it's a hybrid plate. It's got some new figures, some old figures. These are black bush robin is completely new. We didn't treat that species before. And the eastern nightingale, the superbus robin, the Canary Island robin, which has been split. But I just read a few days ago that the Canary Island robins have now been split into two. You just can never be on top of these things. Dan has painted the owls that he knows so well. It's much the same arrangement of plates, but he's painted them anew with some lovely little figures like this Arctic fox. Pacific loon is now occurring so regularly, again, I think largely due to photographs, and identification has been confirmed, and everyone becoming aware that it's not just three divers, 3 loons now. There's a 4th one that we have to take into account. Some new terns, including this species, Saunders tern, which when I started this plate, I thought I was only going to have to illustrate the summer adult, because that was the only plumage that could be identified with Saunders tern. But when I started to look at all the photographs on eBird, something really surprising happened, and I discovered quite quickly that the juveniles are very different from little tern, that they have this white secondaries, and little tern always have this plainer wing. And then that led me to realize that the adult winter is different, and these two, Saunders tern and little tern, have been considered almost indistinguishable for many years. But the reason is that for the last 40 or 50 years, we've all been seeing Saunders terns in Oman and UAE in winter. They're all little terns. There are no Saunders terns there. The Saunders terns all go out to the Indian Ocean on these little atolls and islands. And that's become very clear now, just from examination of all these photographs that are available online. So I was very excited to discover what Saunders tern really looks like, but a bit disappointed to realize that I've actually not seen one, because the only place I'd seen them was in Oman in winter, and now I realize they're all littles. Some more plates painted by Dan. And again, some extended sooty tern and bridal tern in particular, and now North American black tern is turning up so frequently that we need to include that in a European guide. And elegant tern, which you have as a breeding species. It's hard to believe. So I'm hoping that at least some of you will feel that there's still a little bit of life left in the illustrated field guide, and myself and David will be able to continue painting digitally or otherwise for the next few years. So thank you very much for hearing me out.